So what I'm going to do is very quickly run you through a very simple study that talks about land use and urban form in Indian cities and shows how poor building regulations are causing sort of perverse outcomes. So I just run you through this very fast and say some things about it. Then Mr. Phatak will add a few comments later on. So this is a bit distorted, but that's okay. That's a satellite picture of Ahmedabad. And if you look at these 4 spots, 1, 2, 3, and 4 spots, 2 in the center and 2 on the periphery, that's where they are. Okay. This is a 500 meter by 500 meter area in the center of town. That's Ashram Road in Ahmedabad. And if you look at how land is used here, this shows that 17.2% is in the public realm, in streets and in parks and gardens. Very small public parks, but most of it in streets. 17% of streets. If you look at all the building footprints here, the land that is covered by buildings, then that is 25.6%. Okay? And this picture is more or less true for a lot of Indian cities and across most cities. If you look at the remaining 57%, practically 60% of the land, is the land that you have in the private domain but surrounding buildings. So it's not in the public realm, nobody can use it. Private people can, but often suboptimally because it's in small slivers of land. And that makes a total of 100%. If you were to take the amount of floor space that this same area has, then the total amount of floor space here is approximately 25 hectares in this whole 25 hectare piece of land. So the gross FAR, gross floor area ratio, and as a planner I'm interested in, unlike a builder, I'm interested in gross, not in what you get per plot, then the gross FAR is 1. So it's a relatively low density place. Like any other city in India, it appears to be congested and it has it seems to be stressed. It's a low floor area place with the land. Now you take square number 2, which is also in center of town. I won't run through all of this in detail, but you can see here the public realm has 20%. The building footprints, the ground floor of buildings, which is of course the most valuable floor and extremely important for the city, you have 32%, and about 50% is this land that you use around buildings. Okay. If you take the FAR here, which is also in the city, is 1.3, no different. You go to the periphery of Ahmedabad here, number 3, take 25 hectares of land, and you get a similar picture. 17% of land in the public realm, which is primarily streets, there's no park you can see here. Building footprints have 25%, and you have 60% in all this land around buildings. Indian cities seem congested partly because of this peculiar land use we have. And you look at the FAR here, 1.8. Well, the periphery is a little more dense here in this case than the other. Number 4 here, similar sort of story, 25 hectares. Once again, a chaotic assemblage of buildings, as you can see here, swimming in all this private land, not optimally used, and very little land in the public domain, which is here 15%, 30% of building footprints, and here the FAR is 1.6. You can see this sort of a haphazard assemblage of buildings. I'm talking about Ahmedabad, but I could be talking about any city in India. Okay, this is Bangalore also, and this is Lucknow also, and this is Delhi also, and lots of places. So if you look here, you see, if you compare the 4 examples here, very little land in the public domain, 17, 15, 20, 17, and primarily streets. So very, very poor allocation of land to streets. And then you have, if you look at all the grays, which is the building footprints, that's also pretty low. Okay, and all this sea of land that is frittered away, so to say, in these slivers of land all around buildings. And the FAR is low all across, gross FAR. You look at Mumbai, and you have a little more diversity, but not very, very different picture. If you were to take Ballard Estate, which is actually better than most other places, you have 26% in streets, so actually a little better. That's building footprints is 35%, and the private open space is 37%. Total gross FAR is 1.41. If you go to Parsi Colony in Mumbai, both of these are older examples, and perhaps that's why a little more land in the public domain. 38% in these nice parks and the streets, 25% only in footprints, and 35% once again a huge amount of land in private domain that is not allowed to be built upon. And the FAR is 1.1. You take Nariman Point in Mumbai, similar, buildings floating inside all this space here, which is 50%. The public realm, because we are including this bit of sea here and green here, looks like 29, but generally it's 20, 25. And building footprints in the center of town, just 20%. And the floor area ratio is higher, but not high by world standards, it's 3.8. You say Lower Parel, Mumbai, you take a picture like this, you get 12% in the public domain, very little. No wonder place seems like congestion. And your building footprints is 38%, little higher because of some of these big buildings here. And private open space, once again, buildings haphazardly strewn in this sort of. Okay, and you have an FAR of 3.4. And your Bandra Kurla complex, there seems to be, because of this garden, more land here, the way we have made the window, 30% in the public realm. And building footprints, again, very little. And you have private open spaces, 46%. Huge amount of land in private open space. So that's Indian cities are mainly private open space. And you have 1.7 FAR. Once again, a similar sort of comparison, 27, 20, 20. If you take typical areas of Bombay, if you take average of Bombay, you will get 20% in the public domain and 20% in building footprints, and the remaining is unusable private land. So let's get, and the FAR is low, a few pockets of higher, generally low. But you compare now cities across the world. You have a place like London here, and if you take Regent Street, the center of town, lovely place. I mean, Regent Street is that's a very, very walkable, nice place. And you have 25. Here you have a completely different picture. You have 30% in streets and in the public realm, all this bit of green and the streets, 65% in the building footprint, and 4.8% in the public, in the private domain. And the FAR here is 3.3. Not very tall buildings, by the way, 7, 8 floors, but you don't need very tall buildings if you allow the footprints to be big. San Francisco, center of town, Union Square, once again a tourist spot, everybody goes there, everybody likes that place. You look at this here, public realm has 36%, 1/3 of the city is in the public realm, streets, 61% in building footprints. The buildings are no more than 8 floors in this area, if I'm not mistaken, 8 or 9 floors, people know this area. Private open space, all these little bits of place, land that is not much utilized, is 2.4%. So you're basically, instead of having 3 domains, public, building footprint, and private, you have public or private. And private is building footprints, all of it. And you have a total FAR of 5.4 here. Once again, very, very pleasant area. Lot more streets. Paris is a lovely city. All of us love to go there as tourists. Here you have 34.4, almost 35% in the public domain. Building footprints is 60%. So the reverse of Indian cities. And you have 10% in these little courtyards in the middle. Delightful city, different form. And 3.4 FAR, like Nariman Point, huh? It's not any. Barcelona, terrific example here, 30% in the public realm, 66% in building footprints, and private open space is 5%. And FAR of 4 in this area. Hong Kong, a special area called Mong Kok, some of you might know this, a grid like that here, has 50% in streets and these green areas here. Building footprints is 33% and 18% in these little lanes behind that are private. Different form altogether, and an FAR of 3.1. If you compare once again, you get a completely different. This sliver of land here, which is big in India, which is private land, poorly utilized, wasted, is thin and small, this sliver in these great cities. And the FARs are uniformly high in these examples. So you have a big difference in the two regimes. Indian cities, I think it's right to say, make very inefficient use of land. They appear to be haphazardly built and they have low FARs. This is a conclusion that's not very difficult to make. You can do more sophisticated studies, but it would be difficult to escape that conclusion. They are inefficient use of land because you really are, lots of land is optimally used. Even if you walk around this area, you will see suboptimally used in the space between buildings. Haphazardly built, this area is not, but others are, and low FARs. Why is this so? Because this is the outcome of a building regulation regime, building development control regulations, building bylaws, whatever you want to call it, that uses generic, and each word is important, uses generic, plot-focused, text-based rules. Our planners have become bureaucrats. They write rules, text-based rules, and they write them generic rules for a whole slew of plots. And they've been doing that for a long period of time. That's what our books look like, and that's what our rules look like. Nobody ever sits down and tries to figure out what the gross outcome is going to be. They write the rule, they say, how much space should we leave between buildings? Oh, does 10 feet seem okay? Oh, okay. No, why don't you make it 14? Obviously, it costs them nothing, so they write whatever they want. Having done that, how do generic plot-focused text-based rules define the shape of buildings and the use of land? Well, it's somewhat like this. If you have a block like this, and this is just a quick example, then you have a block formed by all these streets around, and you have different plot sizes. You don't have these rectangular plots, but it's just an example. Then there are lots of rules that define margins and setbacks. Some areas, every city has something different, but more or less all of them have some regime like this. Some common plot requirements are worked out, visitor parking requirements are worked out, some green space, you must leave that much green space, a whole slew of regulations. That finally leaves only that much land that can be covered by buildings, after all these rules are taken into account. And even this is sometimes not fully usable, because there's one additional rule saying that despite whatever it remains, you still have a maximum coverage limit. So there's some additional rule like that. So there's a whole set of rules. Each plot has a different shape and a different size. So each one, the rules apply to them differently. So every building turns out to have a different form. Then there is some height restriction that is put, and everybody gets a shape like that within which to build. So that's your development envelope that the rules create. And this is, obviously some buildings in front, some are at the back, some is here, some is there. It's a bit, the haphazard nature of buildings is precisely because nobody's ever tried to make them straight. and because of a set of text-based rules that play out differently in all the different plots. Then you have an FSI regulation that tells you that despite your development envelope, you can only fill up that much. Then you have some other regulations which will tell you that you are allowed to buy some more from somewhere. So some people decide to stick in a few more floors here, there. That adds to the haphazard nature of the building. And finally you get some unutilized areas. Now what can be done in this place? This is the problem. What can be done in its place? Okay, that's always the more interesting question. The problems everybody knows. We must go back or use a building regulation regime that uses area specific, that creates area specific plans, plot specific, form based regulations. What does that mean? Instead of using text-based rules and writing on files and creating using a word processor to make building regulations, you must go back to the drawing board and you must actually draw. Okay. So how would this work? If you had something like this, you would say, okay, I'm going to define some uniform set of setbacks, let us say. You can do what you like with it, but as soon as the setbacks are done, you be a little more relaxed. I'm not going to get into too much detail here. You need to be relaxed about how much land you will force people to consume in gardens and this and that and the other. And you get some coverage like that and then allow everybody to use according to that coverage. Once you have done that, you can define a uniform height, you can get a uniform set of buildings like this, define an FAR if you like, and then everybody builds up. The outcome of this you know from the beginning, so you know how much gross FAR you are creating, and you can much better plan that way. How do the two compare? The two would, you can I just run through this. So you get a haphazard, poor utilization of land in one regime. In the other one, you can actually check what outcome is going to be, and then you can decide what you want to do with it. Has such a regime been used in India before? Of course. That's exactly how Ballard Estate was planned. Otherwise, how do you think all of these buildings came up to line up in this perfect manner? And how did they all have the same height? And how did they all leave this perfectly shaped space in the middle? Somebody, instead of writing text-based rules, somebody sat down and actually drew up this place. Okay, so you had a different regime of doing it. And you ended up with an area that is denser and has more land in the public domain and uses land efficiently. And you get a lovely city. It's not bad. Huh? Most of us like this area. It's terrific sort of a city here. Fort area was also similarly done. And you get a much better land utility. At least you know what you're going to get. In the other regime, the problem is you don't know what you're going to get. Eventually what's going to come up, nobody knows. Ahmedabad Central Business District Plan makes a new plan for the city that does exactly the same sort of thing, but on an existing city, because that city is being redeveloped. Much like your Worli area of everything is being redeveloped. When everything is being redeveloped, we have a very low density center, as I showed you earlier. The gross FAR is no more than 1, and only 25% of land in building footprints and 22% in the public domain. But instead of writing a set of rules for this, we started off with a map of the area. Once you have a map, and if you look at this one square here, this is just a 1.5 square kilometer area, and you have a small section here. You look at the haphazard buildings that are here, and you start drawing up a future city. In this future city, you first need to define the roads. You might also want to put in additional roads. You can always tell somebody that if you build a new building, you'll have to give this land for a road. That's why you have, for example, this alignment here, which really doesn't have a road, but we say if you make a new building, well, we'll let you get the FAR for this, but you will put in a new street here. So you draw up a plan like that. Then you draw up the streets. Then you draw up the setbacks. The remaining land is all buildable. These are the individual plots on it. These are the setbacks from the buildings. From the roads, you don't have big setbacks. Actually, now the roads are bigger, so you don't need setbacks of that sort. And you define some other rules. We want Bombay-like arcades, so we always make use those pictures and say you will build those arcades. And then we say that instead of the low density city, you will get a new high density city which has a gross FAR of 5, but the building footprints instead of being 25% will be 50%. The land in the streets instead of being 22% will be 40%. And so you can see that the land, what has happened is that all that land which was wasted in the private domain has been brought into the public domain and shared with the landowners so they can also build, and we get increase also the green cover in the city. So that's how we are doing, and that's how the future of it. So what looks like this just now will slowly get built, but with a much better use of land. So it can be done. Okay, thank you, Mr. Phatak. Sorry, more time.
I think cities are going to expand, and also they are going to transform and redevelop. So I think we need to pay attention to both in terms of planning. And as was explained, that the way cities are currently built have a problem in terms of lot of open space around the buildings and not being efficiently used. What are the basic fundamentals in that? It's the way we think is that the space on the ground has only one single use. If you want to have land around the building for light and ventilation, it's only for that, and nobody can walk on that. Or if you need an area for the fire engine to go around, then it's only for fire engine and nothing else can be used. But if we want more efficient use of land, then one must also think of multiple uses of those spaces. The areas around buildings can also be used by pedestrians to walk across. And that is one of the problems in Nariman Point, where you cannot walk across the buildings. Now in Bandra Kurla complex, in some part, it has been attempted that there will be no compound walls, so people can walk between the buildings and across the streets to improve the walkability as well. But finally, I think the main thrust of this is that you cannot solve all these problems by doing a conventional development plan. You must have the local area plans for the local areas which are going to transform. It also has something to do with what kind of FSI regime, which is plot specific, is being used. Like in Mumbai, if you are a cess building, then you can get much more FSI. So in a block of land for local area plans, there may be few buildings which are for cess buildings, they'll get much higher FSI where the others won't do. So now that kind of regime cannot also work. Then you must have an overall plan where these kind of things are done. And I think Mumbai faces that as a major challenge, that how to get the local area plans implemented, where you get onto the drawing board and draw your footprints and open spaces and things like that.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about land use regulation in the rest of the world. First, I want to tell you that I'm not at all against regulation at all. I'm against bad regulations, which is very different. And I think, again, like Mr. Patel, I think that a lot of people who are thinking about regulation do it in a very abstract sense without really understanding what are the consequences, there are side effects. The good news is that India is not alone. There are bad regulation all around the world. And my experience is that they are getting worse and worse, with more and more consequences. More and more, I think that planners are, in a way, frustrated architects, and they want to use regulation to design cities in their detail, and these are economic consequences. To the point I will show at the end of my presentation that the people who are now sounding the alarm are not necessarily urbanists or mayors, they are macroeconomists who think that bad regulation are in fact decreasing the GDP of a country are also disturbing land market. They are preventing productive people to come to city where they will be more productive. This, for instance, what happened in the United States, where somebody wants to come and live in New York or San Francisco, which are extremely productive city, cannot come anymore, and therefore you have a loss of productivity. So normally urban regulation were there to prevent negative externalities. That means, for instance, if you had a very tall building next to a small building, especially at the end of the 19th century, it will prevent light from going there. And at the time, light was very expensive and very important. So the first, I think, building regulation were done. So it was, there was also, especially at the end of the 19th century, separation. You know, you didn't want to have a lead melter in the middle of a residential area. The new regulation has nothing to do with lead smelter in the middle of it. It's something else. So, first, city structure are driven by markets. Planners fail to recognize that. I will demonstrate it with this graph. Some of you may be familiar with it. This is the pattern of densities. If you start from the city center and you divide in circle and you measure the density within those circles, you see that here we have 12 cities which have nothing to do with each other, different culture, different climate, different economy. All of them follow the basic the standard urban model. You have a decreasing density from the center to the periphery. This is driven by markets. The density itself has nothing to do with the design of planners. It has to do with supply and demand for floor space. That means if you reduce the supply of floor space, your density might very well increase. One, because there will be less of it, people will consume much less. For instance, you know that in India, like anywhere else in the world, if informal settlement were usually only one floor, sometimes two floors, but usually one floor, have much higher densities than high-rise building because people consume less. Manhattan in the 1900s had a density which is double what it is now, although they were much smaller buildings. So again, the density was established not by the design of tall buildings and that, was established by supply and demand. Influence on markets. This is Jakarta over a period of 50 years. The center, the CBD has moved by 12 kilometers. This was drawn by market. It is, I've been involved in Jakarta all that time. I can tell you the planners never planned that. It was just the market recentered the city toward its center of gravity. Before the center was a port, and then it moved down. So again, this is what planners have to take into account. This is Seoul metropolitan area. Over a period of between 10 years, you see that the increase in population has been mostly in the far suburbs, although at lower density than the center. The center practically, the density in the center has decreased, the number of people has decreased, and the number of jobs, although there have been more in the center, altogether there have been more jobs in the periphery than in the center. This is a worldwide trend for large cities. Dispersion of job, dispersion of population. So again, this is a market. So among all that, if you look at the affordability in cities, and if you compare, you take a very simple, the price-income ratio, which price-income ratio is a good measure of affordability for cities where the market is recorded, where there is no informal market, and where the market is, when you have a transaction, it's put in the book at its real price. I will not use the price-income ratio in India, for instance, for obvious reasons. So you see that all those cities are pretty well managed. They are affluent countries. You have enormous, the price-income ratio, that means, normally you consider that housing is affordable if it's below 4. After that, it becomes a little stretch. Now you see cities, which are delightful cities, like Vancouver, Sydney, Auckland in New Zealand, which have, a price-income ratio of 9 or 10. A city like Auckland in New Zealand, it's not that it lacks, land. It's not like, say, Singapore, for instance, or Hong Kong. New Zealand has the same area as the UK, but with a population of 4 million people. So it's not lack of land, it's just regulation. So many regulations constrain both the vertical and the horizontal expansion of cities. So this reduces the supply of land and therefore increase prices. It could also increase density in a certain way, but decreasing the consumption of floor space. What is important, as Mr. Patel said, is really the floor space you create. A city is not made of land, it's made of floor space. What is important is the floor space. Without floor space, there is no city. So, the floor ratio, or the FSI, depending, and again, it's a bit, your graphics were much better than that, but it's a theoretical graph showing that you can increase the FAR, and depending on the shape you use for, the lot coverage, you will have completely different building. So on one end, if you want, you could increase the size of street the way it was done, for instance, so it's being done in the center of Ahmedabad. You can change the land use, have wider street. Or on the contrary, maybe in some residential area, you can consolidate, in a central courtyard, the thing, and you'll have a much more efficient. So again, just to concentrate on the FSI is not a very good thing. You have to look at, again, the whole thing. One thing that I found everywhere, not only in India, but also in the United States, is the minimum, either plot size or minimum floor size. This is, again, planners think that they can regulate themselves out of poverty. The higher is the plot size or the minimum apartment size, they think that people will be able then to have a larger one. It's just the opposite. Here, for instance, I draw on this graph horizontally household income, the income distribution of a city, which has usually this shape. And above that, I put another graph which has the same income horizontally, but vertically I have the housing consumption. So here, the higher you put the minimum legal consumption, the larger will be your informal sector. People are not going to leave the city because you put a new regulation saying that the plot size have to be 200 square meters. They are going just to go in the informal sector. So again, the informal sector is directly, now, this is also true in New York. Now in New York, you don't have really an informal sector, but you have subdivision of building. And in the 19th century, you had all law tenement, which still exist now, and they are grandfathered. That means that you can still use, they have been remodeled, they are extremely comfortable, and they are below, the most old law tenement give apartment of about 26 square meters. But the minimum new apartment size is 38 square meters. Now the city is trying to put 27 square meters, which is nearly the way. But then they run into another regulation, is that every block has a maximum number of apartment per acres, and therefore you can. So developers, for instance, who knows that there is a high demand for studio, most households in New York have about, if I remember well, it's 1.3 per household. It's very small. There are a lot of people, young people who are starting to work in New York. They cannot find most of the apartments have 2 or 3 bedrooms. You are not allowed, in fact, a developer will feel that there is a demand for small apartment, cannot do it because they will be above the minimum number of apartment per acre. Now, what happened, of course, is that people then get together and rent together an apartment, and this is allowed. So in a way, the density again here adjusts. The market adjusts the density. It has nothing to do with the number of apartment per acre. So the planners have this illusion that they can plan density. Density is not design. They can plan setback. They can plan the size, the street size. They cannot plan density. This is an extract of New York, a wonderful article in the New York Times. Here in the middle is Washington Square. It's next to NYU, that's why I took this. This is, the West Village is one of the most expensive area in New York, in Manhattan. All the building you see in red, which is practically most of the building, are in violation of the current code. This is why I'm saying that the new regulations are much worse than the old ones. Now, those violations are not violation of, say, fire regulation or health or connection to sewer. They are purely spatial. So all the buildings which are in red here are either too many apartments. Would you believe that there are too many apartments in New York? Too tall. This is the West Village. It's one of the lowest area actually compared to too much commercial density. Now, what planner could decide what is the correct commercial density in Manhattan or in a special street of Manhattan? What knowledge do they have to decide a number like that? And finally, too much lot coverage. So again, here we are going back to Mr. Patel. So I will, this is not only our idea of some planners that we want to change things. The one who are really have been looking at it and saying it has a terrible impact on the economy of the country are usually macroeconomists. So I have here just a quotation of 3 that I have taken. Chang El-Tsei and Enrico Merotti. Poor land regulation create labor market imbalance. Kate Barker, maybe some of you know Kate Barker in London. She's she has been. She has been. She has been knighted, by the way. That's always a good thing. And she has also looked at the regulation in London. Now, not the building regulation, but the Greenbelt regulation, which decreases the supply of housing and the impact it has on affordability, which means that people, in order to work in London and find affordable housing, are obliged to commute, 80 or 100 kilometers. And finally, Ed Glazer in the US, also look at the labor market aspect. So these are the exact quotation. For instance, Moretti said that the regulatory constraint decreased the US GDP by 9%, nearly 10%. This is serious. This is very serious. Kate Barker also, her conclusion, this is really what we have been talking about. One of the striking features of the local planning process is a lack of any reference to price signals. When the price of housing goes up quickly, planners should take notice and they should take action. They cannot blame speculators. They cannot blame something. They are the ones to be blamed. They are in charge of the supply of land and floor space. And finally, the quotation of Ed Glazer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things we've been thinking about a lot is how do we change the discourse about planning in India. And so we can do about 40 minutes of Q&A now. So whoever would like to start.
Bimal, I think you're quite wrong when you say planners have become bureaucrats. It's exactly the opposite. Bureaucrats have become planners.
Well,
And I haven't seen a single drawing. I haven't seen a single layout which has emerged as a regulation. We are not preparing any layouts for growth of any of our cities.
That's the problem, yes.
It's really bureaucrats who break their planners.
Which is the same thing, no problem. The planning is being done in so,
Yeah, I was
The planner's plan in DP Mumbai was discarded, and bureaucrat's plan was.
yeah, but you see, what I meant was
It's
that
almost accepted now.
what I meant was
What Phatak prepared is now has been substantially revised by the bureaucrats. So he's right.
well, in any case, what specifically we were referring to is this idea of writing up rules that everybody has to follow without, in more general sense, without seeing what the outcome of it is going to be. The impact of it is not self-evident. You might write a rule here for any, you can write a rule, it's very easy. Say, let's have a setback, let's have a margin, let's have a FAR, let's have this. It's very easy to write it because all it requires is it's well an intention to write it and the authority to write it. But it's very difficult to figure out the impact of this regulation on land use efficiency, on affordability, on the productivity of a city. So you are, in a sense, what we have ended up doing, and cities of the world have ended up doing, so we shouldn't be just talking about Indian cities, have been handing over authority to regulate in bits and pieces the functioning of it, and the growth and building up of a city, or the transformation of a city is regulated in bits and pieces, and often has very, very perverse outcomes. And that's essentially what we are talking about. And definitely in India we are suffering hugely on account of that. We have very, very poor land utilization.
I have 2 points to make. I'll ask you from emanating from your talk. One is, of course, related to planning. That when we come down to area level planning, which BMC had, for example, planned in the beginning, but now it has been virtually given up. If you don't have broad guidelines at a city level, how do you pin down the land usage at the area level without giving scope to individuals to make misuse of that? That's point number 1. Second is, when we try to reduce the private space, unbuilt space in the private domain and increase the built space and the public space, correspondingly, so that there is more space available on the roads and footpaths, etc., and open spaces, so that the densification doesn't really happen. You don't see too much crowd at a particular point. In the current context of security, fears of people, that like 10 Downing Street is opening straight onto the road. So how do you marry that fear of security issues when you open up the private space and try to share with the public by taking out the the gated community kind of compound walls and such like things. So how do you marry that?
So let me, I'd answer that just, should I?
Yes.
Yeah, just 2 questions you're asking. Let's take the second one first. I'd say just take a walk at different times of the day in Ballard Estate. There's no compound walls there. And if you go and look at that, I've walked around the area, it's one of the loveliest, anywhere in the world it's amongst the loveliest places. And tell me how insecure you feel compared to having a 5-foot margin and a compound wall somewhere else. So I don't want to answer that question. I think you will answer it if planners were to actually walk cities. That would change everything.
Yes.
Okay, that would change a lot of things. And when we were doing some work, I'd say, when we write those regulations, I've been on many committees where those regulations are written, and been the only madman saying that there's something wrong at work here. And all I feel like telling them is, let's all go for a walk instead. And let's see what people are actually doing, instead of sitting here and imagining in abstract what sort of rules to make. So that's the answer to your question. Go take a look at Bangladesh State, and if I feel that even in other places where there are buildings right on the margin, there are hospitals, there are houses, there are things, all sorts of places, people manage these in very effective ways, and it's possible to do that. A 5-foot margin or a 10-foot margin and a compound wall is not going to add hugely to your security. Architects automatically figure out ways in which to deal with the security.
But then why there is such a craze nowadays for the communities and having their own open spaces inside and have multiple buildings or tall buildings, so that you leave less footprint?
That's the only thing that is possible today. There is nothing else that is possible. Actually, the bylaws have already determined. No architect, nobody is determining that building form. That is determined by the bylaws and the planning. The shape of our cities, when any architect here, people here know very clearly that the building is designed long before the developer comes to you. You are only doing you are just pulling the shape out of the bylaws and so it's more or less done. So I don't think that the form that we are presently adopting is something that is out of choice and it's coming straight out of the regulations. The problem is that they are poor regulations. So the form that is coming out is poor. So if you were to make the regulations with the form in mind, you might do something different. That's point number one. The other one you asked was about how would you design a city if you didn't know what it had to serve, what function it had to serve. And here, we teach now in lots of planners, young students, everybody gets scared because they think, you see, the biggest problem we have is we think of a city as if it's a bridge, or we think of it as a corporate town like Jamshedpur or something like that, company town. Cities are not company towns, they are not bridges. When you design a bridge, the engineer will ask you first question, what load do you want to take on it? What's the span? What's the cost you want to spend? Everything is pre-specified and then you design the bridge. You do that because you have to and you can say all of those things. In a company town like Jamshedpur or some such town, which actually such towns, Jamshedpur actually gave the model for Indian planning. In this town, you know everything. You know how many people are going to work there. You know what incomes they are going to have. Okay, you know what requirement of traffic is going to be there. You know everything, and you know that with certainty into the future. And that's going to change. Then the company is going to take a big decision at some point and increase everybody's salary. So everybody is going to use more water because their incomes have increased, or they're going to use more electricity, and then there will be an augmentation of the supply. But cities are not company towns. You have no control over anything at all. You have the planner sits there with the belief that a city is like a company town or it's a bridge, and then asks a question. So typically what our planners do is they sit down and the first thing they say is, okay, let's project the population. So they make one low projection, one high projection, a medium one, then they select the median one. Then they say, okay, now let's work out what everybody will need in that future town. So the plan horizon is 20 years. Then they work out in the 20 years, they'll say, oh, they will need so much housing, and they need so much water supply and drainage, and this and that, and schools, so many schools, and they'll need so many hospitals. You even have some venerable guidelines that will tell you that, central government issue, which will tell you all of that sort of thing. But you've forgotten one simple thing. First of all, the population is not in your control. But even worse, you don't know what incomes are going to be in the future. And in India, incomes are rising, they better rise. I mean, all of us want them to rise, don't we? Yes. If you have rising incomes, you can't figure out consumption. If you don't know what the future income is going to be, you don't know how much transport people will consume, how much of housing. As soon as we get more money, we eat more, we entertain more, we use more floor space, we buy more clothes, we go to friends' places more often, we do everything more. Now all your projections about the future are on very shaky ground. First of all, you don't know how many people are going to be there. Then you don't know how much consumption is going to be there. And yet we go ahead with certain that in the future we know what's going to be, like we know what the bridge has to hold. Then we sit down and say, okay, now let's work backwards. Development plan is made. So we'll need so much land, so much EWS housing, so much middle class housing, so much high-end housing, this housing, that, so many gardens, everybody will consume so much garden space, this, that, and the other. Then we design a city in some degree of detail or whatever. This is what everybody does in every planning office. I tell you, even in CEPT, they fall back into doing that all the time. Then they design a city and they say, now everybody has to follow this plan. Okay? Sadly, the future turns out to be different. And now the plan becomes a stranglehold on the city. Because you're sitting there telling everybody, follow the plan. Nothing doing, follow the plan. And soon, finally, the dam bursts and everybody says, to hell with you. We'll do what we want and the plan can do what it wants. And that's the story of every Indian city. Now, who's created the problem? Are we, then we blame ourselves, we are not law abiding, we don't have enforcement, we don't have this, we don't have that. It's faulty planning to start with. It's planning that is based on completely wrong assumptions. You are trying to make a certain plan when there is no certainty. Okay, so what would you do in its place? What would you do if I'm not saying don't plan, because without planning you'll have anarchy. So what is that minimal amount of planning that you would do? Perhaps something like Manhattan did. Put 50% of land in the streets, you can't put more. Infrastructure is any case built over and over again. You think they built all the infrastructure for Hong Kong? 40 years ago, the planners knew what Hong Kong is going to be like. You are digging up the streets all the time. Everybody in the world does that. So, and you don't even have the money to build world-class infrastructure today. At $1,700 per capita, what can you build? You can't build nothing. Leave some space and get going on it. And don't try to control too much else after that, because if you try to control, once again I'd recommend a walk in Bombay. Figure out how many people are actually following your rules. And they're not following it and the city is functioning. No, it'll function, don't worry. So that's essentially the point. We need a new way of doing planning which is far more liberal, far less company town style planning, far less engineering bridge style planning, but a planning that actually lets cities transform and change, like Alain says. So we need cities that use planning in the way that he has titled his new book, which is to come out in June, which says we have to understand that markets have a way of ordering. They create order without design. You will have order without design. And that's essentially, I'll stop at that. Sorry for that big lecture, but I've become a bit of a professor now.
I have a question. If the market is going to decide everything today in Mumbai...
No, I didn't say everything.
No, today in Mumbai, what we see, there is a big divide. There's a huge gentrification happening. Poor people are getting, pushed outside. We have gated communities. We can't call it an inclusive city. What happens to that? The kind of divide which we see. We have 50% people living in slums.
Okay,
What do we do in, yes, we will have a great form. How do we create a mixed income, kind of a city which we had earlier actually?
Okay.
You had it earlier with less regulations. I think that Mr. Phatak should maybe answer this question, but I think that your very large informal sector, which has grown as the income of the city has increased, is due specifically of your restriction of vertical expansion and horizontal expansion and misuse of the existing land. It is not, it is not due to poverty itself. Again, there are probably 5 or 10% of the population which will require assistance. In every country it's like that. But the rest should be able to get housing on the market.
Absolutely, getting housing is fine, but in terms of, we are seeing this distinct, difference in terms of, if you see in South Mumbai,
Yes.
income divide, I would say,
Yeah, but they are illegal. It's because they are illegal that they are so poor. That the conditions are so bad. Sorry, I'm afraid
Yeah,
this is
way
really
to answer your question is that it's like this. Presently, actually the problem is worsened because the regulations don't allow developers to create really low-income housing. Essentially, that's the problem. Since the regulations don't allow you to create really inexpensive housing. Now, inexpensive housing, mind you, will have lower standards than expensive housing, correct? I mean, by definition. But our planning regulations set up certain standards that you must meet if you want to build legally in the city, which is why the poor are forced to build illegally. Now, in the old days, when there was no planning, even in Mumbai or in Ahmedabad, there were mill workers who used to come here. So they used to come here, and for them the market used to produce housing, and they were called chalis. Planners, I mean, if you're going to create housing that they can afford, it's going to be of that sort. Unfortunately, and we can go into detail, but just now you just have to take my word for it. If you take the planning regulations, those type of chalis are no longer possible. Those type of chalis are no longer possible to build because they would presently be illegal. So in fact, what I am proposing appears to be like leaving it to the market and then makes you fear that that means only the rich will be served. The market will happily serve the poor if you will allow them to. At present, we are not allowing them to serve. Let me give you another example.
Is it really
Suppose everybody, if everybody, let me give you an example.
The market is projecting a minimum 30 square meter of a house in Mumbai. Minimum cost is going to be 60 lakhs.
That's
Which is
big.
what is,
Yeah. Let me get.
Whereas the construction cost is not more than 1,800.
I'll explain to you in a slightly different way. There's two things that need to be explained. You must come and join CEPT University or something.
I am from Seth.
So rejoin it. It's the new CEPT University. You must come to the new paradigm CEPT University, okay? Because I can see that they've done a old paradigm job on you. So in any case, let me explain two things. Suppose, to give just a sort of an analogy, Indian planners they have deep concern for the poor and for everybody. So they start writing standards and say every apartment must have so much green space, so much fire safety, so much this, so much that, etc., etc., etc. They keep writing like this. If indeed, okay, and they then jack up slowly the standards that all people have to follow. Now, one portion is this raises up construction costs. They also say certain density of land use. That means the amount of land you have to consume per square foot of built space is also fixed by the planner. Okay? So the planners are affecting the price of housing, whether it be the land component or whether it be through their regulations. If this were done, suppose let us say that Indian car industry urban planners all moved to the car industry and they decided tomorrow that they will behave in the same way that they did for the automobile industry. They'd say, cannot be in the 21st century, every kid has to be safe, every kid has to be this, that, etc., etc. Everybody must have, this much comfort is necessary, you must have this much, must have airbags. All the cars will have certain high standard. It means everybody will have to drive around in a Mercedes. Actually, the car industry is not regulated as much as the building industry. And as a consequence, the car industry produces a series of vehicles from nano, which has very low safety standards, to Mercedes, to those who can afford. All I am saying is let the building industry also function in a slightly similar fashion. If you compare the two, you will find a lot more regulation in the building than in the car one. Okay, and that's essentially an answer. You might not be convinced, but we can take longer on that.
I think Shloka had a question and then.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you both for your presentation. They were fascinating. So 2 questions to the both of you. One is, if we're navigating a parallelized state, essentially, how do we look at it perhaps from a more grassroots level? Is there a way in which to focus on decentralized, incremental, small-scale improvements that are driven by community-driven projects? And therefore, how do we sort of galvanize urban entrepreneurs at a much more smaller scale impact, but perhaps a more sustainable one? And then the second question is with relation to the next generation of urban planners. How do we build capacity here, and how do we retrain that next generation? What can we do?
Well, on the first question, yes, certainly, in a certain way, what Mr. Patel is proposing is to just separate the private part from of land to the public one, and put just a general envelope on what is on the private, piece of land, and then let the people build whatever they want there in terms of size, in terms of providing it meets some basic health regulation, like for fire or something like that. But basically, he's saying, do not fix consumption. There is a difference between fixing minimum consumption, and again, he took the example of the car industry. I would take the example of the food industry. In Mumbai, you find extremely expensive restaurants, but you can also buy food in the street, which is very cheap. And this is all private. You do not have a cheap restaurant or, the equivalent of public housing where you are on the waiting list of 10 years in order to get food. So this is, this is what grassroots means. In a way, when you see somebody on the sidewalk preparing food and selling it, this is grassroots. And we should allow this type of thing in the building industry also. Now, the education part is definitely yours. No, the second question was...
Second generation.
Oh, how do you change?
How do we build capacity?
Well, what we need is essentially a paradigm shift in the way that the word is used in a lot of places. You need to shift the whole way of thinking. When you're viewing the world from a particular paradigm, it appears a certain way, and then if you were to now that sort of paradigm shift comes about is very difficult for it to come around in any field. It's not easy, so it's not a I think some of it is just a matter of sort of the slow evolution of a new paradigm. It requires people who are beholden to the earlier paradigm to sort of make way for the ones who are with a new paradigm. But it can be helped along by changing education, which is where Mr. Phatak comes in. He is Dean of the School of Planning and hopefully trying to train a set of new planners who think differently and who says if the market, and I love your example, if the market can produce food for the lowest end and the topmost end, is it heavily regulated? And it can do it precisely because it is not. Because you have a guy who can sit there and make a dabeli for you or whatever it's called, a vada pav it's called. And at the other end you will have high-end restaurants. Okay, and they are not, the nature of regulations that you have there, which are only for, basic health and safety, and then forget the rest. The rest of it, don't try and design what everybody is going to eat or has to eat or must eat and you will get a better situation. So we have to sort of try and create that situation, whatever it is, in however way, that's a better functioning system than the one we have for production of buildings. Yeah. We do not have to imagine that the problem is because of evil developers or evil politicians or evil architects or even evil planners. It's just because we have locked ourselves into a poor way of functioning and are unable to solve the problem at that.
I think most of the people here are from Mumbai, and the Mumbai's situation is worsened because the regulation started on an old paradigm, as you have been calling. People have realized that they are not working, but instead of changing the paradigm, they have been creating exceptions to those rules, and these exceptions over exceptions have created a mess. And then now people think in terms of no, the city is not inclusive, the city has a problem. Now, I think one of the critical problems of Mumbai is land because of its nature and topography. So a strategic plan would have essentially concentrated on creating more land on one hand and also creating more opportunities for building taller. Now both haven't happened on the scale on which it was required. Even today, the opening up of land by investment in public transport is not happening. All the new public transport investment is happening within Greater Mumbai itself. Now, if you invest in public transport in Greater Mumbai and still say that the floor space and population must be constrained, then it's going to result into counterintuitive, counterproductive results. So I think the need for a long-term strategic plan is still there in case of Mumbai, unlike some of the other cities. And what are those strategic investments and needs? That also needs to be considered.
Go ahead. Sorry, I forgot to mention this earlier, but just name and affiliation so we all know.
So my name is Subhishesh. I'm from Jones Lang LaSalle. It's a property consulting firm. How do we separate land use planning and interference of political interference? So I have a strong belief that any land use planning will be mired by political interferences, especially in cities like Indian cities. So let's take the example of this slum rehabilitation. 55% of Mumbai land is under slums. And there is
80% land and 50%
land is
so if you have to build, so the SRA relocation rules, say would put 70% consent clause that 70% consent needs to be there for relocation, for first of all giving a go-ahead to this SRA authority to reconstruct. Plus, they have to be rehabilitated in the same land area. Now this is something which is, how do you have a generic land policy under a situation like this where each pocket will have to be rehabilitated in the same land area or in the same vicinity? How do we implement generic land policy, land usage policy in that kind of situation?
It's for you, Ms.
I think you're right. In certain points of time, the political interventions will come up. Now, what kind of political intervention? SRA is essentially promising, and perhaps a false promise, that everybody who is currently living in slums will get a free house. And what is the mechanism of getting that free house? Is to charge the new home buyers of the cost which is required for rehabilitating the slum. Now that is not going to work because you are increasing the cost of new home buyers. So less number of houses will be built, less number of slum dwellers will be rehabilitated. And this we have seen for last almost now 20 years. And the number of slum dwellers who have benefited is a very small number. So this idea of promising a free house to 50% of Mumbai's population, and also promising a free house to chawl dwellers, who again are about 15 to 20%. So a 70% of population has a false promise of a free house. if this is how the policies are going to be there, then there is a problem. And unfortunately, because the politics is such that nobody will come out of this. This is a golden trap for politicians. If in an election somebody says, no, I am going to change these policies, no free houses anymore, he is bound to lose elections. So I think those kind of things are going to be here, but the question is therefore of rationalizing the FSI regime, which removes these things that generally the FSI will be 1 and 1.33, but if you do SRA then you will get more. So you are creating scarcity of development rights and then using them for your goals, whatever social, political, etc. Now this is not the way to handle things. Creating scarcity cannot be a public policy tool. But it has become like this, but that will create distortions, which are obviously the case. Now, when would people realize this? That's the real question. Slum dwellers have waited for 20 years. Perhaps not. Perhaps many of them have realized that they are not going to get free houses. So they are probably making investments in improving their own huts, adding one more story, and all those kinds of things. But whether a plan can avoid political intervention? No. No, you can't prevent political.
If I may just add to it, it's planning seems to be the only place where where I see this sort of a thing. When everybody is worried about affordability, and if the prices of sugar go up, creates problem. How do you bring down prices of sugar? Ultimately, you increase supply. Planners are the only people who, when they see unaffordability, want to clamp down on supply and want to insist that we must have less floor space. I would say the problem is completely different. We would say that, listen, yes, affordability is a problem. Now, the real challenge to me is, how am I going to expand supply? What does that mean? That means I will need a lot more floor space here. It means I will need a lot more transport. I'll need a lot more land. All that wasted land, if we were to bring into buildings, then you would not only increase street space, you would also increase floor space. So is there a way in which we can expand supply? The answer is, if whatever you do, I'd propose like this. Whatever solution you suggest, if it is finally not going, if that solution is not saying increase supply, then throw that solution into the garbage and start thinking again. Okay? I'm not saying one solution is right, but the general direction of the solution has to be increased supply. If whatever policy you are proposing is going to restrict supply or to diminish it, then you are working against exactly what you want to do. And everything we do as planners in that old paradigm restricts supply. Therefore, you have to cut that contradiction. Now, it seems counterintuitive, but that's the only thing you can do. You have to allow more floor space, you have to use the land more efficiently, you have to create more transport, uske liye infrastructure karo. Whatever you need to do, but increase supply. Because if there's no sugar, if you need to export it, import it, do whatever you want, borrow money, do whatever you want, but the only solution to bringing down the price of sugar is to increase the supply of sugar. Now, as a planner or a designer, you can't tell me that I am going to reduce the price of sugar by restricting supply. That sounds completely nonsensical to me.
But there is one
Sir, that is absolutely
It's important.
Yes,
I think there is one important catch in what you are saying. I am Ashok Data, transport economist. I think economists are important in this kind of debate. And why think like that? When you say increase supply and decrease supply, for whom and at what cost? Let us start with that two component, land, which is, I was learned in my college days, is natural resource created only by God. Whereas construction is, the cost of construction is steadily going down as a percentage total price. I have studied for last 50 years the cost Mumbai out. So really speaking, if we can make it affordable, it's very easy to make it. If you provide near the construction cost, everybody can afford it. Everybody. There is no problem with demand and supply. Only question is that what is the price of land for affordable housing? And that I think where all the supply siders are completely ignoring it.
Sir, one more point. Yes, creating supply is right. But if you are going to create supply, you create ghetto properties in Mankur and use a TDR and use it in Bandra, that is definitely you're trying to divide. You are creating supply, but then whom are you using it for?
Madam, I'm not suggesting, I'm not suggesting any particular solution. I'm saying finally, whatever solution you come up with, final analysis, tell me it's going to increase supply, then do it. Otherwise, don't.
But increase supply from
No, one second. Increase supply overall. Okay? No, I'm not saying.
Need not be overall, because there are 200,000 flats are empty. And they keep on being made more and more of them. You see the advertising space of all the newspapers is full of selling flats, they can't be sold. So there is a great contradiction and we don't seem to face it. The supply shortage is there only because of land. Suppose you can make land at a very low price, at a current price available, and at construction price, I'm sure everybody in Mumbai will afford.
How do you increase land price?
But the price of land, if it can be paid over time, in whichever way, I don't think that would be a problem. Now that is a serious political issue.
Great.
How can you avoid
increasing,
paying the cost of land?
there are many ways of increasing the supply of land. One is what was described by Mr. Patel, reforming land use. But the other one is transport. And the investment in transport in Mumbai is, if I look at it and compare to other cities of the world, is amazing that basically you are still relying on railway line which was built at the time of the Raj. This is really the main thing. And I think that if you could, if you look at the topography of Mumbai, if you could build those bridges finally and open up the other side, you will increase the supply. The supply of land is the amount of land which become developable, but it is what is the time from this new piece of land you develop to where the jobs are. And if you can reduce to less than 1 hour commute, so that your transport system has to adapt to that, then you increase the supply of land. And if it increases enough, I understand your point that the rich are going to, there's so much demand from the rich here in Mumbai for land that they are going to preempt it. If there is enough supply of land because of new infrastructure, you will see that the rich will prefer to live in some area and will not be so interested in other area. And it might be even very close by, and if you allow also, there are part of the world, cities, where the poor can outbid the rich in expensive area precisely in consuming less. For instance, in the Kampong area in Indonesia, in Jakarta, the government within those perimeter allow the people to adjust the size of street the way they want, because the compound is small enough that they are within a walking distance of a main road. So the people adjust their consumption, and in a way, if you look at the rent per square meter of land, they are outbidding the rich, because the rich want to have enough space for a car, for a garage and things like that. So you see again this flexibility, the same thing that happened on food. Imagine that you regulate again the food distribution by saying, well, everybody should be seated at a table, and the table has to be that high, and there should be a cover, and as I am French, I would say you should serve a glass of wine too. Well, you will see that the supply suddenly, the restaurant, the food industry, just cater only to the rich. And you'll say, how come? How is it possible that only the rich have access to food? This is just regulation. and infrastructure.
So I know we have a lot more questions, but I have promised them that I will get them to the airport on time. So we have to end here. But a very big thank you again. I think there's a long conversation to be had on, planning thinking in the country. This will be up on our website in a couple of days. So, and I think contact details are available. So feel free to get in touch with us.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so
Thank you.
much.